The bells of Florence rang with joy, but Catherine de Medici's heart was quiet. She was only 14, a child wearing a crown too heavy for her small frame. From her balcony, she watched the city blur beneath her tears. Tomorrow, she would leave Italy forever. The Medici family had arranged her marriage to Prince Henry of France, a union forged not from love but from strategy. She was told it was her destiny. "You are the key to peace," her uncle had said. But even at 14, Catherine could see the truth. Peace had a price, and she was the payment. The journey to France was long and cruel. Her silks were soaked with sea salt and fear. When she arrived at the French court, the nobles whispered in corners. "She's Italian," they sneered. "She's not royal enough." But Catherine smiled anyway. A fragile, practiced smile she had learned from her tutors. She had been taught that a queen must never tremble. In Paris, the streets overflowed with celebration. The marriage between France and Florence was a spectacle of gold and white. Trumpets sounded. Candles lit the cathedral like stars. Catherine walked beside Henry, who barely looked at her. His heart, everyone whispered, already belonged to another, a woman named Diane de Poitiers, twice his age, and far more powerful than Catherine could ever hope to be. But she tried to believe in fate. As she stepped into the great cathedral, she whispered a prayer beneath her breath. "Let me be loved just once." The priest's words echoed. The crowd cheered. The crown shimmered in the candlelight. Yet when she looked into Henry's eyes, she saw only distance and something colder. That night, as the court feasted and danced, Catherine sat alone at the table, her young hands trembling on the polished wood. She watched Henry move through the crowd, his laughter soft, his eyes following another woman. Every smile he gave Diane felt like a knife beneath Catherine's ribs. But she kept her posture straight, because in the world of queens and kings, heartbreak was not a wound, it was training. As the night deepened, a storm began to build beyond the palace walls. Thunder rolled across the French sky, a warning no one could hear. By morning, Catherine would no longer be a child of Florence. She would be something else, something the world would one day fear. And the bells that once rang for her wedding would echo for her awakening. The air inside the bridal chamber was thick with perfume and whispers. Dozens of courtiers crowded the doorway, eager to witness what should have been a royal union, but instead felt like a cruel performance. Catherine's heart pounded beneath her jeweled gown. The chamber glowed with hundreds of candles. Silk curtains framed a bed large enough for a queen and her fate. But there was no warmth, no love, only cold ceremony. Her husband Henry stood beside her, silent as a statue. His eyes were not on her, but on her, Diane de Poitiers, the woman who ruled his heart. When the doors closed, the silence was deafening. Catherine tried to speak, but Henry turned away. His hands trembled not from desire, but from restraint. Outside, the whispers grew louder. Is he with her? Will he touch her? The cruel curiosity of a court that feasted on scandal. Hours passed. Catherine sat on the edge of the bed, her wedding dress heavy as armor. She prayed for kindness, for a single word that would make her feel human. But when Henry approached, it was not to comfort her. His movements were stiff, mechanical, a duty to be fulfilled, not a promise to be shared. The night unfolded like a punishment. The pain came suddenly, tearing through her frail body, a sharp cry swallowed by fear. Blood stained the white sheets, the symbol of a queen's virtue, while the crowd outside celebrated her suffering with laughter. Her physician was called in the early hours. They said she was dying and that her body was too weak, her blood too thin. She drifted in and out of consciousness, hearing only fragments of their words. She's bleeding again. The Duchess must be revived. Through the haze, Catherine saw Henry leave the room. He did not look back, and behind him Diane appeared, elegant, composed, cruelly calm. She whispered something to the maids, a smile ghosting across her lips. It was then Catherine understood she was not a bride. She was a pawn in another woman's game. The hours crawled toward dawn. Catherine's body trembled, her lips pale as the sheets. The physician pressed herbs against her chest, desperate to keep her alive. When the final wave of pain broke through her, she felt something inside her die, not her body, but her trust. As the first light of morning crept across the room, Catherine opened her eyes to a world forever changed. The girl who had come from Florence dreaming of love was gone. In her place lay someone else, someone colder, someone who had seen what mercy looked like, and knew it did not exist. Outside, the bells of Paris rang again, the same bells that had celebrated her wedding. But now they sounded different. They sounded like laughter at her grave. And in that sound, Catherine made a silent vow. One day they will all bleed as I did. The doctors said she would not live through the week. But Catherine de Medici refused to die. She lay beneath silk sheets, pale as snow, her body weak and broken. Yet her mind burned. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Henry walking away. She saw Diane's cold smirk. She saw the court laughing at her pain. And so she stopped crying. She began to listen. The French court was a theater, full of masks, lies, and secrets. The same nobles who had mocked her now whispered around her bed, believing her too fragile to hear. She learned who hated whom, who owed money, who envied the king. She learned that information was sharper than any sword. When she finally stood again, she did so slowly, like a ghost relearning how to walk. Her reflection startled her. The soft, hopeful eyes of Florence were gone. In their place was a calm, calculating stare. She began visiting the gardens where courtiers gathered to gossip. They thought her naive, a wounded dove. But Catherine smiled, asked gentle questions, and let them talk. Within weeks, she knew every secret the palace tried to bury. One afternoon, she passed Diane in the corridor. The older woman wore pearls and arrogance in equal measure. Their eyes met. Catherine lowered her head as if in respect. But when she lifted it again, her smile was sharp enough to draw blood. For the first time, Diane looked uncertain. At night, Catherine studied politics, astrology, medicine, anything that gave her knowledge. If Henry would not love her, France would fear her. Rumors began to shift. The little Italian girl, they whispered, is not as harmless as she seems. But Catherine pretended not to hear. She played her role perfectly. Soft-spoken, obedient, invisible. Yet in the quiet corners of her mind, she was already building her future brick by brick. She visited the king's library often, pretending to admire the tapestries while overhearing his advisors. She learned the art of patience, to wait for weakness to strike when all believed her incapable. One stormy night, lightning cracked over the palace. Catherine stood by the window watching the sky burn white. The world outside was chaos, but inside her there was perfect clarity. She realized the truth: survival was not about strength. It was about control. When the thunder faded, she whispered to herself, "They took everything from me, so I will take everything from them." By dawn, she was no longer the wounded bride. She was something else. A serpent draped in silk. A queen in the making. And in the reflection of the darkened glass, Catherine de Medici smiled. Not with joy, but with power. Years passed, but Catherine never forgot the taste of humiliation. Every smile at court still hit a blade. Every whisper reminded her of that night. The laughter, the blood, the betrayal. But the frightened girl from Florence was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew how to wait and how to wound. Catherine became the quiet power behind every conversation. She learned who betrayed whom, who desired what, and who could be broken with a secret. When the king's advisors schemed, she listened from the shadows. When rivals mocked her Italian roots, she smiled sweetly and remembered their names. Her greatest weapon was her silence. France's nobles mistook it for weakness, but Catherine had discovered that a whisper, when timed perfectly, could destroy a dynasty. Then fate handed her a gift. King Francis, Henry's father, fell ill. The court descended into chaos, everyone vying for influence, desperate to secure their place before the inevitable. Diane de Poitiers, still the king's beloved, grew careless. Catherine watched her move across the palace with confidence, unaware that her enemies were growing. When Francis finally died, Henry became king. Catherine, now Queen of France, stood at his side, but she was no longer the timid wife. Her crown gleamed like vengeance. Still, Diane clung to power, wearing jewels gifted by Henry himself. She signed decrees, spoke in his place, and humiliated Catherine in front of the court. But Catherine's revenge was not loud. It was precise. She began by winning over the people Diane ignored: servants, guards, the lesser nobles. She gave them attention, kindness, and quiet protection. Soon rumors began to swirl of Diane's greed, her arrogance, her manipulation of the king. Catherine didn't start the whispers. She only made sure they spread. Then came the tournaments. A grand celebration, knights, banners, music, and fire. Henry insisted on participating despite the warnings. Catherine watched from the balcony, her face serene, her heart unreadable. As Henry lowered his visor, she caught a glimpse of Diane in the stands, smiling proudly, the way she once had on Catherine's wedding night. Moments later, the lance struck. It pierced Henry's helmet, a splinter through his eye. The crowd screamed. Catherine did not move. When Henry died in agony days later, Diane's world shattered. Catherine ordered her banished from court, stripped of wealth and power. The queen stood over her rival one last time and whispered, "You taught me how to survive, Diane. I thank you for the lesson." As Diane was dragged away, Catherine turned toward the throne. The court bowed before her, some in fear, others in awe. The girl who had once begged for love now ruled through fear. And as the crown settled on her head, she finally smiled, not as a queen, but as a conqueror. The serpent had become the throne itself. The palace that once mocked Catherine now bowed before her. Her word was law. Her eyes were everywhere. Ministers, priests, generals, all feared the quiet queen who smiled like an angel and struck like fate. France trembled beneath her gaze. Enemies disappeared in the night. Those who plotted against her awoke to find their families ruined, their names erased. They whispered that she consorted with astrologers, poisoners, and spirits, that she ruled through sorcery. But Catherine knew the truth. She ruled through knowledge, through pain. Her sons, each crowned after the other's death, were fragile, sickly boys crushed beneath the weight of France. Catherine became the power behind every throne, the silent architect of survival. When the wars of religion tore her country apart, she chose not sides but stability. If blood had to flow to keep France whole, then so be it. On the eve of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, she stood at her window once more, the same way she had as a young girl leaving Florence. Below her, Paris glittered in moonlight. Soon that light would turn red. The decision was not made in rage. It was made in silence, the kind only those who have buried their innocence can understand. To her, this was not murder. It was order. It was survival. When the killing began, the bells of Paris rang again. Catherine closed her eyes, hearing their echo through time. The same bells that had once celebrated her wedding, mocked her pain, and now sang for her vengeance. They said she became a monster. They said her heart was cold, her soul cursed. But in the quiet of her chambers, when no one was watching, Catherine would hold a small locket. Inside it, a portrait of herself at 14. The Italian girl who had dreamed of love, the girl who had died on her wedding night. Sometimes she would whisper to that memory, "You did not deserve what they did to you, but I made sure they never forgot your pain." The candles around her flickered as if in answer. Her enemies called her the Black Queen, the Serpent of France. But history would remember her as something more, the woman who turned suffering into strength and fear into empire. When she finally died, the court fell silent. Some said they saw tears in her eyes. Others swore her last words were a prayer. No one truly knew, but the bells of Paris rang one last time, and somewhere far beyond the reach of kings and courts, the spirit of that 14-year-old girl, the one who had once been humiliated, broken and forgotten, finally slept, because Catherine de' Medici had won, not just the throne, but her vengeance,